Hi, everyone. Thank you, Layla and Talin. I really appreciate this chance to talk about my research. And I want to thank ARISC generally for its very generous support of my work this summer. And I'd also like to thank my friends at Western Caspian University who were kind enough to be my hosts during this summer. And the university was an academic home to me. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen now to get the presentation up here. Okay. Can everyone see that all right? Looks good? Okay, great. So I'm talking today, this talk is a bit of a mashup of several talks I've given in the past about Russian Jewish immigrants to Baku at the turn of the century. It includes data and research on both commercial activities and cultural activities in Baku. So I'm going to be reading from a paper with some comical asides in the middle, perhaps. If you get bored at any point and you want me to mix it up, write something in the chat and I'll try to be a little more entertaining and pedagogical. But in the meantime, I'm what you have. So in 1919, when writing about the Russian Jewish community of Baku in the city's Zionist newspaper, the Caucasus Jewish Messenger, one editorialist remarked that this population was always looking back to their origins. They had once resided in the quote, Pale, and are still knotted to it by 1,000 threads. Even at the empire's southern frontier in the oil boom town of the Caucasus, Russian Jews articulated a connection to the Pale of Settlement. And you can see the Pale of Settlement there. It was the area that is today much of Eastern Europe, where Russian Jews were legally mandated to live during the period from the late 18th century until the collapse of the Russian Empire itself. According to this editorialist, the nearly 12,000 Russian Jews that had migrated to Baku in the last quarter of the 19th century explored often their social, economic, and cultural ties to their former homes in Eastern Europe. Although they had remained in the Russian Empire itself, these Jews made up one iteration of a broader dispersion of Russian Jewry that included, among others, the millions that made their way to the United States during this same historical moment. Although migrants to Baku had not crossed into another country or crossed an ocean or moved to another empire by settling in the city, they had traveled a long distance and had transgressed the boundary of the Pale, which to that point was the main legal and symbolic restriction of their lives. At the same time, connections persisted. In large part, economic and commercial networks had ferried Russian Jews to this new location, and they were tied to their homes by import and export businesses that required them to be in constant communications with their bosses and principals elsewhere in the empire. The image of threads that this editorialist pointed to, tendrilled across the expanse of the Russian Empire, tying Russian Jewish migrants to their homes, calls to mind what scholars of diasporas have called a, quote, transnational social field, that network of connected institutions and people crisscrossing national borders. Throughout the last 4 decades of the empire's existence, Baku was in the process of becoming, through the actions of its Jewish residents, a new point within this social field and mental geography. In Baku itself, Russian Jews found themselves among and between various other groups and societies, what the Zionist leader in the city, Jakob Weinschall, once called a, quote, kaleidoscope of peoples. Azeris, Armenians, Georgians, Poles, each elaborating their national cause in this crowded environment and waving their own, quote, flag. In 1919, when both the Russian Empire and the Caucasian Federation had disintegrated, the newly and briefly independent Azerbaijan Democratic Republic formally confirmed that its public consisted of these many national blocs, due in large part to the influx of migration to Baku that the city had experienced since the 1870s. 5 seats were allocated in the country's parliament to represent its, quote, national minorities, and several of those communities were authorized to form their own minority councils to serve their needs. One such council was established by Baku's Jewish political parties, all of them, including Zionists, Socialist Bundists, the National Volkspartei, and the religious Aguda Yisrael, themselves all migrants from Eastern Europe. Thus, the Baku Jewish National Council, which I'll call the council from here on out, was born, and the city's Jewish population had official recognition as a distinct entity among all of the others in the city. Today, I want to discuss this trajectory from the migrations of the late 19th century to the national community codified in the crises of the late 1910s. I would like to consider how and by what means Baku became, for certain Russian Jews, a new node within the broader worldwide Jewish diaspora. This process was not so straightforward. A Russian Jewish social collectivity did not exist solely on its own, but was fortified and buttressed by economic and cultural projects alike. This process, first of all, involved the commercial and mercantile networks that legally allowed for Jewish migration to Baku in the first place, which is the subject that I'll talk about first in this talk. Economic activity formed the girding of a Jewish social field that extended across the Russian Empire, giving some institutional form to these diasporic migrations. Such enterprises and economic endeavors connected Russian Jews, even as they spread to far-off locations and far from one another. But the formation of what was called by the council often the Baku Jewish Public was also a retrospective project in 1919, one that the council took on and required specific discursive techniques employed in its Yiddish newspaper, the Caucasus Wochenblatt, or Caucasus Weekly, and the Russian language Zionist Kavkazsky Vestnik, the Caucasus Jewish Messenger. The second and longer section of this talk describes the ways in which the Jewish leadership of the council responded to its official task of representing the Jewish minority of Baku and Azerbaijan broadly. The council was comprised of a majority of Zionists, yet these activists spent their days considering life in Baku, not only a potential migration to Palestine. They made regular appeals to an Eastern European heritage. They also sought, as we will see, to engage with and attempt to ethnographically understand their relationship to Azerbaijan's non-Eastern European Jewish population, the Kafkazgi, or so-called mountain Jews. In 1919, the council sought to conceive of Baku's Jewish community in its own political and cultural terms. That is to say, several of the council's leaders sought to demonstrate that the Baku Jewish population was itself just one small part of an organic Jewish nation that existed in thousands of individual locations throughout the empire and throughout the world. The result illustrates the techniques devised and employed to bring the Jewish nation into existence outside of what was considered its true center in Eastern Europe. Overall, the goal of this talk is to consider these various threads that tied Baku's Jewish migrants to the Pale, both those threads that existed as commercial necessities and those that the council articulated in order to bind together what it saw as a community unraveling. In doing so, I hope to demonstrate that the Russian Jewish transnational social field, as diasporic scholars call it, operated distinctly at two levels. It was at once and initially a social reality defined in large part by commerce. At the same time, it inspired in the council's leaders the belief in a single Jewish nation that existed non-territorially or not territorially bound, and to which Baku's Jewish public belonged. Okay, so to start off, we'll talk about the merchants and commerce. I found this photo in the Russian National Archives online photo gallery is in a collection of a Baku-based architect from the end of the 19th century. And it purports to show Jewish traders on a street in Baku. The presence of Jews in Baku emerged alongside the commercial development of the city in the last quarter of the 19th century. This included, of course, the oil boom of the 1870s that made Baku a center of one of the world's most important commodities. As Verena Doran has recently shown, Russian Jews migrated to Baku in part as employees of the oil shipping companies, like those established by Aaron Kahan and his prolific family. Similarly, other Jewish entrepreneurs like the Dembo brothers made a fortune in Baku's growing kerosene transportation and marketing sector. The eventual president of the Baku Jewish National Council, Alexander Guchman, was himself the manager of the Baku branch of the Rothschilds' Caspian Sea Oil Company. The presence of Russian Jews in the oil industry was so remarkable that the city's commodities exchange even attempted in 1886 to bar Jews from entering the market building itself. It seems, however, that this tactic did not succeed at all, at least not regarding the small-time competitors of larger oil refining and marketing operations like the Nobels and the Rothschilds. In a 1908 report written by a Baku official to a Duma representative, it is stated that Jews in the cities were involved particularly in, quote, the trade with oil products and the small-scale export of purchased kerosene to Russia, and that the intermediation on the oil exchange, so brokering deals on the oil exchange, is almost entirely a Jewish business, end quote. A report from the Yiddish daily Der Freund remarked that Baku was a city of Menachem Mendels, by which he was referring to the classic Yiddish novel by Sholem Aleichem, whose main character is a Jewish stockbroker and commodity futures trader in Kiev. Other industries were also vital for allowing Russian Jewish merchants to see Baku as a developing market to which they might migrate and set up shop. The sugar trade became the focus of thousands of such figures. By the end of the 19th century, 70% of the sugar supply to northern Persia was of Russian origin, and Baku was the main thoroughfare for transporting this product abroad. The Alexander Sugar Company of Kiev, owned and operated by the Jewish Brodsky family, was the largest producer and exporter of this commodity to the frontier, accounting for a quarter of the sugar refined in the Russian Empire writ large. Several sugar operations in Baku employed Jews in major positions, including the government's own trade and industry company in Persia and Central Asia, which was managed by a Jewish merchant from Mogilev named Lezer Kroll. A contemporary scholar of the sugar industry remarked that it was the firm of the Russian Jew K. Sherman that first pioneered the trade route extending from Kiev to Tehran. This scholar also emphasized that it was Jewish merchants and traders that did deals across this wide area using commodities warehouses that had been established by firms like Brodsky's and Sherman's. In the same official report about Baku mentioned above, the author emphasized that, quote, representatives of almost all of the major sugar refinery firms are Jews, end quote. This trade in particular influenced not only the demographics of Baku, but other cities along Russia's southern border as well. The Brodsky's company established a warehouse in the city of Poti in the early 20th century to aid their export efforts. Ashgabat and Tashkent similarly saw the growth of their Jewish populations as merchants seasonally entered to participate in the export of and import of commodities. One report describes that many Jews arrived in Ashgabat in the fall to participate in the trade of sabza seeds and fruits. If anybody has been to Central Asia or to Baku in particular, they know sabza plov, which uses these small fruits. And this report also mentioned that in Ashgabat, all of the representatives of the sugar companies were Jews and had attained permanent residency in the city. So it seems that circuits of mercantile activity emerged at this time as sugar flowed south and east and dried fruits, nuts, and rice moved to the interior from Persia. Indeed, this particular economic activity is just one iteration of a broader trend occurring throughout the Russian Empire during this period. Starting in the late 1850s, the imperial government had allowed certain Jews to live beyond the Pale of Settlement that I mentioned earlier. Here we have some oil fields in Baku. This is particularly the Rothschilds section. And this is a picture of Israel Brodsky, the head of the Brodsky sugar firm. Just wanted to show some of those to you. Russian Jews employed in specific jobs could take advantage of this limited liberalization of the 1850s. Jewish dentists, watchmakers, jewelers, lawyers, and other artisans applied for certificates to live throughout the empire, and thousands rushed to St. Petersburg, and as has been well documented by Benjamin Nathans. But these new regulations on Jewish migration also applied to merchants, who were permitted to live anywhere beyond the Pale as long as they acted as representatives or agents of members of the First Guild of Merchants. That is to say that prominent Jewish merchants in commercial capitals of the Pale, places like Minsk or Vilnius, could vouch for the Jewish merchants in their employ and allow them to live in important export-import nodes beyond the Pale. The result was a formalization and expansion of Jewish diasporic networks that had operated throughout the world for centuries. Gradually, Russian Jewish merchants crossed the borders of the Pale and became crucial ligatures of commercial activity in the empire, forming a lattice structure for the export and import operations at precisely the same moment that Tsarist industrialization policies made the exploitation and transport of commodities produced in the colonial periphery a huge business. This phenomenon only became more prominent following the imposition of the so-called May Laws of 1882, which restricted Jewish rights in the Pale. Russian Jews made their way to Baku and Tashkent at the same time that their co-religionists set up shops in other large industrial cities like Lodz and Warsaw. In these new environments where they had no right to live on their own accord, Jewish merchants acted on behalf of their benefactors in other cities, themselves by and large Jewish. One further example that I wanted to talk about regarding this trend, which I was able to actually study further here in Baku, thanks to my ARISC funding, has to do with cotton production in the Caucasus and the textile industry then growing in the Kingdom of Poland. Here's some statistics on sugar transport. For people who can read Russian, you can see that the largest exports of Russia to Persia during the years 1910 to 1914 was definitely sugar was the highest, and second were textiles, which I will talk about now. This is I.K. Poznansky, who I'll talk about in a moment. At the end of the 19th century, cotton plantations in the Caucasus and in Turkestan emerged to compete with American and Egyptian firms. And by the 1900s, Russian textile producers looked to these enterprises as a cheaper alternative that did not require importing from beyond the empire's borders. A true pioneer in this regard was I.K. Poznansky, a Jewish textile producer in Lodz. He began sourcing his cotton from the Caucasus and established agents in Tbilisi to oversee this process. Indeed, according to an early 20th century government report on Jews living in the Caucasus, one Jewish manager of cotton supply, the Mogilev-born Gomshaw was his last name, we don't know his first name, relied specifically on providing the output to merchants from the Poznansky factory, who then transported it to Lodz for production. After Lodz, Russian Jewish merchants that had moved to the Kingdom of Poland in the 1880s, and especially after the expulsion of Jews from Moscow in 1891, marketed textiles that were produced in Lodz to the Russian interior, consumer markets in the Russian interior. Contemporary commenters regularly attributed the success of this Polish industrialization to these Russian Jewish merchants dispersed throughout the empire, circulating both from the origin of and to the destination for these manufactured products. There's actually in the Achundov library, which I was thankful enough to have access to during my time here in Baku, there's a 20-page pamphlet on cotton production in the Caucasus, printed in 1916, that really spells out this connection and was very useful for articulating some of my findings. And also in Achundov, I found one newspaper article in the periodical Kaspi, which they have the entire run of. It's an imperial Russian language newspaper. They have the entire run at the Achundov library. I found one article about trade in Bukhara, the Central Asian city Bukhara, and it mentioned both in one article, Poznansky cotton traders in the city and sugar traders of the firm K. Sherman. So even when not focusing on the Jewish origin of merchants in particular, journalistic reports indicate how prevalent Jewish merchants and firms were in these export and import practices. And yet, despite the possible fortunes that could be made in this mercantile activity, and despite the penetration of Jewish merchants into the commercial life throughout the empire, the residency status of these Russian Jews living beyond the Pale was deeply precarious and always up for debate. Russian Jews living beyond the Pale were subject to regular audits, and lacking proper documentation, it could result in their deportation back to the Pale. Much confusion surrounded the degree to which Jews could actually hold rights beyond the Pale, and the Yiddish daily Der Freund regularly printed legal discussions about specific cases. In fact, it is due to this constant fragility that Russian Jewish merchants made an impression in the state historical archives that I got to look at. In Tbilisi, for instance, I discovered several lists of Jews under investigation for expulsion from cities throughout the Caucasus. I can show you some of those now. Let's see if they come up there. Jewish agents in this position relied on their principals to establish their documentation correctly and confirm their employees' reputations if local officials questioned residency status. When these lists were established, being able to name a specific employer could mean the difference between continued prosperity on the frontier and the ruin of one's business due to deportation. In this sense, connections between Jewish merchants working throughout the Russian Empire sustained the work of the members of these networks themselves, allowing agents to engage in export and import activity in the Caucasus far from the traditional Jewish geography of Eastern Europe. Such networks crossed the borders of gubernias, oblasts, empires, and significantly the Pale of settlements. They formed a long-distance social field unto itself. And you can see here, this is one merchant mentioned in these lists of people who might be expelled from the Caucasus. This is from Baku especially. This is one sugar merchant named Steiner, who we'll actually hear from right now. And you can see it has the name of his the person, his principal, the person he was representing is listed here as well. So while these Jewish merchants were deeply entangled in these specifically Jewish networks, they also individually integrated into non-Jewish networks in order to conduct their commercial activity. They needed to in order to deal with the Persian, Armenian, and Russian merchants that resided alongside them in Baku and beyond. When one Baku Jewish sugar merchant, this Yanko Libovich Steiner, when he found that he might be deported to the Pale, he petitioned the local government to allow him to stay in the city. In this appeal, Steiner emphasized that he himself acted as an integral node in the functioning of commercial networks at the southern frontier. Quote, "In Baku, I have successfully tied together wide trade relations with many firms that are both Russian and Persian, who, despite not knowing my principal, or his boss, do enormous business with him in the name of trust in me personally," end quote. In fact, should Steiner be deported, he claimed, this network would immediately fall apart. His purchase of commodities were almost always conducted on credit, and without the commercial liquidity that was conveyed through him by his Jewish principal, the circuit of trade from sugar factories in Ukraine to fruit merchants in Tehran would come to a halt. In his own words, quote, "This is why expelling me from Baku would harm the interests of both my principal and of many non-Jewish Baku merchants," end quote. So difference was an acknowledged fact of commercial life in the Russian Empire, even in the 20th century. And mercantile activity existed within these distinct but intertwined social fields of Jews, Persians, Armenians, Georgians, and Russians. Credit, initially extended along ethnic lines, could then be extended beyond these networks in order to facilitate trade. It was this distinction among many peoples at the southern frontier that the Baku Jewish National Council sought to codify and articulate when it came into existence as a political project nearly 50 years after Jewish migration to Baku had kicked off in earnest. Weinschall, whose memoir we talked about earlier, mentioned in that document that Jewish activists had attempted for years to carve out a, quote, national space in this raucous boomtown for their fellow Eastern European Jewish migrants, just as their counterparts had been doing in the major centers of Jewish life in the rest of the Russian Empire. In his words, these activists sought to create an oasis, quote unquote, of Jewish life, one that would distinguish itself from the other national movements developing in the city with, quote, strong borders. So we're going to get a sense now of how they attempted to do that. The council was dedicated to building cultural institutions in Baku in order to meet the specific needs created by its position far from the hegemonic center of Jewish life in the Pale. When the council opened its landmark institution, the Jewish National House, in September 1919, the Zionist periodical came out in strong support of the mission, calling it the most excellent day in the history of Baku Jewry. There were other institutions that the council tried to set up and succeeded in setting up. One of them included a kindergarten for Jewish students. I have a picture here of them, if I can find it. I think it's back here at the beginning. Yes, here it is. This is from ourbaku.com, which is an excellent site if anyone wants to take a look and do their own research. They have historical documents, historical photos, all very interesting. I just wanted to point out that this child right here may be recognizable to some Azerbaijanis specifically in the audience. It's Lev Landau, the Soviet Nobel laureate in physics. As a very, very young child, his father, David, was a migrant from Riga and one of the managers of the Royal Dutch Shell Company's branch in Baku. And in fact, David Landau was the brother-in-law of Jakob Weinschall, whose memoir I have been discussing already. Okay, let me get back. This is the letterhead of the Kavkazsky Evreysky Vestnik, the Zionist periodical in Baku, and you can see here Weinschall is the editor there. Great. So where was I? The council argued for the value of such institutions by envisioning the continued relationship with Eastern European Jewish traditions that would inspire Baku's Jewish population. The council's cultural programs were understood by their creators as a living link to the Jewish heartland, a transnational imaginary that extended past the borders of independent Azerbaijan and which was aimed towards Eastern Europe, just in the same directions as the commercial networks that I just discussed. On the 18th of June, to take one random example, the Messenger reported that leaders of the Jewish National House, recognizing that its constituents might feel, quote, separated from the rest of Russian Jewry, end quote, organized a night to celebrate the works of the great Yiddish author Yitzhak Leibush Peretz. In fact, the stories that they chose to read aloud from Peretz were from Mutter und Kind, Mother and Child, which was dedicated to the children refugees of World War I. Stories emphasizing the ties that bound generations of Jews together highlighted the event's goal of providing a space for Jews to connect with their roots in the Eastern European Jewish cultural tradition. Even more illustrative of the deep ties with the Jewish heartland that the council intended to use as a foundation for Jewish life in Baku was its reaction to the pogroms that erupted in 1919 and throughout the course of World War I. In November of that year, the council produced a 4-page pamphlet in response to the pogroms in Elizaveta and that featured articles in both Yiddish and in Russian, and which was entitled The Days of Tragedy. The pamphlet was above all a tool for demanding that the Baku Jewish population, quote, sacrifice for the benefit of those suffering in the center of the Jewish world. In this task, the peripheral location of Baku, according to several of the authors of the pamphlet, would indeed benefit the distressed Jewish nation. Spared from the worst destructions of the war due to its location far from the Eastern Front, the Baku Jewish community claimed that it was well positioned here to spearhead the reconstruction of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Council members saw it as, quote, our duty to save the nation from death, end quote, a slogan that served to justify the aggrandizement of their institutions. The council printed another pamphlet with just the headline, help, on the top, that was written by the founder of the Baku Jewish Literature and Music Society. And it urged readers to raise consciousness of the Baku Jewish public. I'll quote it at length here because I think it's important. Don't throw away this newspaper. Put it somewhere to remind them. Soak up the national misery in these pages and letters and carry it with you. Read it to your kids or let children read it to their parents. Tell each other about this national suffering and hand this pamphlet out along with thoughts and hopes for the whole nation. As a direct result of the council's emphasis on its constituents' responsibility to and identification with its national brethren abroad, the spirit of Jewish nationalism would be internalized in each of the Baku Jewish migrants. A vessel for carrying the nation, each Jewish migrant in Baku would then inculcate in the other Jews of the city a sense of community and belonging. A call to serve the Jewish nation would strengthen the ties that bound Jewish migrants in Baku to these new national autonomy institutions. The council's efforts would serve as a dual national purpose in the same act, saving the Jewish civilization of the Pale while also further strengthening a Jewish community beyond its center in Baku. This was the goal, at least. There's one other important test or illustrative test of the council's attempts to create and perform the Jewish nation in Baku. And that was the other Jewish populations of Azerbaijan. Baku itself contained populations of Kavkazi or so-called mountain Jews who had migrated to the city from the northeastern Azerbaijani city of Guba, as well as Georgian Jews, the term that the council used in these discussions to describe Jews from the Western Caucasus Mountains. Unlike their Eastern European counterparts, Mountain and Georgian Jews did not speak Hebrew or Yiddish by and large, but rather had their own idioms, Judeo-Tat or Jehuro or Georgian, respectively. With the establishment of the council, these non-European Jewish populations became a part of the official Jewish minority, as it was defined by the Azerbaijani Democratic Republic. And therefore, these non-European Jewish communities were tied to the institutions that the council was attempting to create, by and large, for a Russian Jewish or Eastern European Jewish population. This was not the first time that Russian Jewish intellectuals had attempted to integrate the so-called native Jews of the Caucasus into a broader national framework. An extensive article about the Jews of Central Asia appeared in Jewish Antiquities, Evryskaya Starina, in 1913, and argued for the compatibility of these two communities of Jews and their shared historical roots. However, there also existed a century of ethnographic work completed by Jews and non-Jews about the degraded and Oriental, quote unquote, status of Jews in the Caucasus. As the new representatives of the Jewish minority in Azerbaijan, certain members of the council were wary of including these divergent strands of Jewish life into their nation, or the nation that they were attempting to form. If imagery related to Eastern European Jewish life was so key to the formation of a so-called Baku Jewish public, then how could the council admit these indigenous Jews in their midst? This group seemingly had nothing to do with the Jewishness that the council sought to propagate, nor anything to do with the commercial networks that instigated movement to Baku in the first place. The tension within the council's relationship to the non-Eastern European Jewish population of Azerbaijan is well exemplified in the Caucasus Wochenblatt, the Caucasus Weekly, which was the council's Yiddish periodical. There was a report in there composed by Hebrew pedagogue F.L. Shapiro regarding the so-called land issue in Guba. Shapiro noticed that throughout the mountain Jews, that although mountain Jews worked the land in the mountains and acted as merchants, bringing wheat to local markets, they continued to live in poverty. Apparently, according to the journalist's investigation, the, quote, unknowable and benighted, end quote, Kavkazi had been tricked by some Russian city official 25 years earlier into paying rent on their own land, their natural inheritance, the author wrote. Now forced to fulfill these contracts, the profits of the land flowed directly to the regional government, and the Jews needed to work overtime as petty merchants or peddlers to sustain their families. Ashamed by their gullibility, Shapiro compared mountain Jews to the biblical figure of Esau, who, in acting impulsively, was swindled out of his birthright by Jacob. The distance between the Oriental mountain Jew and the sophisticated journalist was clear in this type of report. And yet, within this condescending and Orientalist description, there was a definite note of sympathy and solidarity among Jews in the Caucasus also. Supposedly, the Kavkazi readily believed the Russian official that tricked them because he had made claims about their safety. The Russian official warned them of the danger to come. The local Muslim population, Tatars he called them, the official was certain, would soon, quote, make pogroms against you, just like in Russia, end quote. This was perhaps not such an outrageous claim. At the end of the 19th century, several Tsarist government projects were aimed at applying to Kavkazi the same discriminatory laws that barred Eastern European Jews from certain trades in the empire. Despite their supposed cultural inferiority, Mountain Jews shared this fear with Jewish political activists that resided in Baku, who themselves, as discussed above, considered anti-Jewish violence as a key symbol in articulating their affiliation with the wider Jewish world. Despite the differences in their supposed behavior and appearance, Mountain Jews could certainly be enfolded into the council's imagination of a broader Jewish peoplehood, according to this journalist. In the May of that same year, Shapiro wrote an expert testimony on Mountain and Georgian Jews at a meeting of the council regarding a new Jewish school it was meant to establish in accordance with its role as state administrator for the Jewish minority as a whole. Creating a Jewish education institution was one of the key jobs that the council had been tasked with, and was a symbolic institution for all Jewish political activists throughout the world, and specifically the Russian Empire. Creating a Jewish school was always discussed as a key element of these political programs across the political spectrum, from nationalists to socialists and beyond. A very peculiar argument arose in the proceedings as to whether Baku's Mountain and Georgian Jewish children should be allowed in the same classes as their Eastern European counterparts, due to the supposed deficiencies in educational institutions among non-European Jews and their subsequent lack of preparation. This was the perception of non-European Jews by European Jews or Eastern European Jews. According to a report in The Messenger, a contingent of Eastern European Jews also blanched at the notion that their children would share a classroom with these, quote, dirty and, quote, Eastern people. The author of the article went on to criticize these protesters, who had somehow, quote, assimilated into themselves the same arguments that Russians had once used to deny educational opportunities to Jews living in the Russian Empire regime themselves. The, quote, ethnic, end quote, differences discussed were superficial, and naturally the council's first job was to wipe them away and create a single, quote, united school, end quote. B.L. Vasker, a Hebrew teacher that had organized a Jewish kindergarten in Baku, that's the picture we saw earlier, extended this stance in his council meeting. The ethnic divisions among Jews were a product of the Tsarist past, when Mountain and Georgian Jews needed extra lessons in order to learn Russian. With minority national rights protected and promoted by the council, such distinctions would no longer be necessary, as all students would learn the same language, the Jewish language, by which he meant Hebrew. The Zionist organ and its advocates in the council were committed to fighting for the national minority right to education in this national language. The opposition countered that separate classes were necessary for, quote, pedagogical purposes. The Mountain and Georgian Jews had, quote, sharply distinct features, as anyone who had read the Orientology of the Hungarian scholar Armin Vamberi. I don't know who this expert is, but he was discussed at length in these proceedings. Anyone who had read them would know about these distinctions. One Yakov Varshovsky, who had lived in Georgia, remarked that differing, quote, inherited skills and experiences, end quote, marked the separation between European and non-European Jews. Eventually, through special training, Varshovsky suggested, the different groups of Caucasus Jews could be raised to the same level of productivity and civilization as the Eastern European migrants. Temporarily, at least, Georgian and Mountain Jews required a different approach in schools, he suggested, and the Jewish nation would, for the time being, be heterogeneous and not exist on some broad equal footing. The leader of the council, Alexander Guchman, who was forced by the legal structure of the council to approve this measure, was truly disgusted by Varshovsky's discriminatory theory of education. He argued that such an approach threatened the health of the broader Jewish nation and declared that preventing a united school system would result in the uneven, quote, cultural and social development of the natural masses. And he feared that Georgian and Mountain Jews would forever fall behind the cultural ideal that the council had set up. Without a united school, there could be no united Jewish nation. In presenting this case, Guchmann compared the current issue to every political schema in existence in 1919. Should the council deny the education for certain people, as was, quote, the relationship between whites and blacks in America, or, quote, serfs and nobles in pre-reform era, or the distinct social classes in the contemporary, quote, city councils of Moscow and Petrograd, end quote? Times were supposed to be different now in the New World Order of 1919. Racial and feudal regimes should be discarded, and communist ones were opposed to the council's political agenda. The council had achieved in its very creation becoming a, quote, democratic representative organ that truly expressed the desires of the Jewish national mass, Guchmann argued. The nation was the fundamental form of human difference, according to Guchmann, the true organizing principle devised by some natural laws and not the observations of Orientalists and ethnographers. The Baku Jewish school system was one landmark institution of this project, so much so that the newspaper article about the discussion that I've just talked about was entitled "A Big Day in the National Council." The, quote, correct, as Guchmann put it, operation of this institution was no quibbling matter. The fate of a united, homogeneous, and thus essential Jewish nation hung in the balance, supposedly. The whole project of imagining the Jews as a single people rested on the council's consistent and equal distribution of national minority rights to all of its constituents through its local autonomy institutions. The reference point for the formation of local Jewish community of Baku was the ideal of an organic Jewish nation. Local institutions for Jewish autonomy were one and the same with the broader Jewish nation, as the particular setting of Baku merged with a broad transnational ideal of Jewish peoplehood. And you can take a look here. Let's see, is it gonna move? Is my presentation moving? Oh, there we go. Here's the headline from that discussion about the school, big day in the National Council, a united school. If you go back here, this is the Yiddish article I mentioned about being with the Mountain Jews in Cuba. So to conclude, I'd like to pull together some of these various maybe diverging points I've made throughout the talk. So the turn of the century saw an expanded geography for Russian Jews. The Pale of Settlement remained in many ways the center of their universe. However, migration had brought Russian Jews throughout the world and had made a Jewish diaspora an even more present social reality and ideal. Not limited to the hegemonic center of Eastern Europe, the Jewish nation was understood as expanding through the work of Jewish activists and merchants alike, as new points were integrated into this whole. We have seen that commercial and economic enterprises brought Russian Jews to the far reaches of the empire and beyond. Once in these locations, political activists set to work articulating the continued connections between these emerging communities and the areas of traditional Jewish life that they had left. In this way, it was possible for Jewish migrant communities to be imagined as appendages or even colonies of the Jewish heartland abroad. A transnational social field therefore existed as real connections for commerce and other purposes, and as an articulated ideology. The case study of Baku demonstrates these two elements of that field existing simultaneously. Thank you.